The door to room 12 slammed shut on its own. A sharp, final bang cut me off from the hallway, trapping me in the room where a body had lain just an hour ago. The lamp overhead buzzed louder, the air growing thick as cotton. I came here for facts, for an article, but found myself in a trap. And I soon realized the man in this room didn't die a natural death, and his story did not want to be told. The fluorescent lights in the newsroom worked flawlessly, a steady, shadowless glare that knew no time of day. Arthur Vance had grown used to this light, though he'd never liked it. The lamps bleached the color from faces, the thickness from paper, the warmth from words. His monitor displayed a blank document, the cursor blinking like a standby signal. The work had begun, even if the text hadn't yet appeared. On his desk sat a mug of cold coffee and a thin stack of printouts, columns of city names dense with unfamiliar surnames. Other people's tragedies, laid out like a schedule. Arthur moved the papers to the edge of his desk, squaring the corners. A habit of order kept his mind sharp. Order didn't save, it disciplined. The email from his editor arrived without a red flag, a standard subject line, a familiar tone. Motel, man, no ID. There were no greetings, no words that might linger in the mouth. Arthur clicked the mouse, expanded the message to fill the screen, and read it through without changing his expression. The words in the email read like a police report. Location, time of discovery, officer's name, address, and the request to keep it short. Short meant safe. Short meant no questions asked. Arthur caught himself already structuring the future article in his head before his fingers had even touched the keyboard. A body was discovered. Identity unknown. Circumstances are being investigated. The phrases slotted together like furniture in a motel room. Helen from the arts section occupied the next desk. She was typing a piece on a local festival, the sharp clicks of her keys cutting through the air. In the pauses, she'd take a sip from a water bottle and exhale as if arguing with her screen. Arthur had listened to this rhythm for years. Another life unfolding on an adjacent keyboard, with different topics and different reasons to smile. Helen glanced up and nodded, a silent confirmation of his presence. She didn't ask where he was going. Helen had stopped asking long ago. Arthur closed the email and opened a new document over the blank one. The file name was dry. Man_motel. He didn't bother adding the date. It would go in the lead anyway. An unspoken discipline governed the newsroom's content system. Every story had to fit within its borders, like a body in a casket. Arthur mentally estimated the length. 300, maybe 400 words tops. His editor preferred clean copy. No dramatic intros, no lyrical prose, no complex sentences. He liked stories that readers could scroll past without stumbling. Arthur respected this directness. It saved a lot of grief. His phone vibrated on the desk. The editor's name, Michael Shaw, appeared on the screen. Arthur answered immediately. "Arthur, you at your desk?" Michael's voice was as flat as if he were reporting a burnt-out streetlight. "I'm here." The Northern Star Motel, room 12. A man, no ID. The uniforms have already processed the scene. I need you to drive out, get a comment, and write it up to format. No fluff, got it? Michael wasn't asking a question. He was demanding confirmation. "Got it." "Good. Deadline is 9 tonight. Sooner if you can. I'll be waiting for a clean file." Arthur ended the call and placed his phone face down on the desk. The gesture helped him maintain a sense of distance. With the screen hidden, it felt like fewer calls would come through. It was a feeling, of course, a keyword Arthur had learned not to trust. He stood, pulled on his jacket, and checked his pockets. Notepad in the left, pen in the right, phone in the inner pocket. Press pass where it should be. The sequence of actions was effortless. Leave, drive, take notes, return, file. a work route that didn't require an opinion. Near the exit, the newsroom smelled more strongly of cheap coffee. A vending machine stood there, brewing its bitter drink as if it were meeting a quota. Arthur didn't stop. He pushed through the heavy door and stepped out onto the street. The city greeted him with damp air and a gray slash of sky. It was that time of year, caught between seasons. Dark patches from last night's rain still stained the asphalt. Cars drove by slowly, without urgency. Walking to his car, Arthur thought of the road as a hallway between two rooms. People don't linger in hallways. His old Ford Taurus was parked at the curb, a little way from the entrance. He opened the door, got in, and turned the key. The engine started on the first try, a fact that was simultaneously irritating and satisfying. The machine worked as it was supposed to. He turned the heat on low and pulled out of the lot. He left the GPS off. He knew the route by heart. Out of the city, onto the secondary highway, then the turnoff for the motel. He kept his speed steady, without sudden movements. A local station played on the radio, the host recounting the news with a tone of sincere surprise. Arthur wasn't listening. The sounds were just background noise, like the hum of the ventilation system back at the office. Beyond the city limits, the road straightened out. Fields stretched on either side, reaching toward a distant tree line. Gas stations, billboards, and bus stops were few and far between. The air held few smells. Inside the car, there was only the scent of plastic, seat fabric, and the faint, bitter trace of an old air freshener. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, his fingers resting on the worn leather wrap, right where his grip had molded it over time. The car, too, remembered his habits. Time on the road wasn't measured by a clock. It flowed according to the signs. End of township, sharp curve ahead, speed limit 55. Arthur saw the signs and obeyed. It suited him, a world that provided clear instructions. The turnoff for the motel appeared abruptly, a narrow exit to the right with no proper markings. Arthur slowed and turned. The asphalt became rougher, the ride harsher. The tactile shift of the road brought him back to a sense of reality. He noted the feeling, and then let the thought go. The Northern Star Motel was set back from the road, behind a small, empty lot. Its sign flickered, the letters glowing unevenly. The parking lot looked deserted, its painted lines faded to ghosts. A cigarette butt lay on the porch steps, clearly old. Its paper was waterlogged and gray. Arthur killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the entrance. The pause was involuntary, a beat he didn't question. He got out, shut the door, and checked that it was locked. The motel lobby met him with warm air and the smell of a carpet that had absorbed too many footsteps. The reception desk was on the right. Behind it stood a woman in a dark uniform. She looked up without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. "Arthur Vance," he said, showing his press pass. The woman glanced at the ID and nodded. "I'm Maria. About the man?" Her voice was calm. There was no alarm in it, no sympathy, no attempt to diffuse tension. She spoke about the matter the way one might speak of a leaky pipe. "Yes, about him. What was the time of discovery?" Arthur took out his notepad. Maria gave him the time. She gave him the room number. She told him who found the body. She didn't add a single detail he hadn't asked for. It was another habit, to provide information only upon request, nothing more. Arthur wrote down the facts, neatly, without embellishment, in his small, precise handwriting. "No identification?" he clarified. "No ID," she confirmed. "His pockets were checked. The police took everything he had. We didn't keep anything." The phrase "didn't keep anything" sounded defensive, as if she were protecting herself from an accusation that was never made. "The key to the room?" Arthur asked. She pulled out a ring of keys and separated a metal one with a plastic tag. The number 12 on the tag was worn away at one corner. "Down the hall to the left," she said. "Third block. I'll tell housekeeping to stay away." Thank you. He walked down the narrow corridor, the carpet muffling his footsteps. The lighting here was dimmer than in the lobby, flickering slightly. The doors were all in a row, identical, with the same handles. A few had "Do Not Disturb" signs hanging from them. The signs looked dirtier than they should have. Arthur walked slowly, counting the doors out of habit. Room 12 was at the end of the row, near a staircase that led to the second floor and smelled of dampness. He stopped at the door and listened. Silence. No television, no running water, no movement. He inserted the key, turned it, and pushed the door open. The room was suffocatingly small. A low ceiling, the yellow glow of a single lamp, and thick, stagnant air. The smell of cleaning chemicals lingered, sharp in his nostrils. The room felt like it had been cleaned too quickly. Arthur stepped inside and paused in the middle, as if measuring the space with his own chest. A bed against one wall, a desk by the window, a single chair, a nightstand. The curtains were half drawn, the fabric hanging perfectly straight, as if someone had smoothed the folds by hand. The body was already gone. He could tell by the empty space where a presence usually leaves its trace. And yet the room retained something. Not a ghost, but a rupture, the kind that any major event leaves behind. Arthur didn't have words for it. He was here to work. He took out his phone and opened the camera. The first shot was a wide view of the room. The second, the desk, the nightstand, the floor. He filmed without any artistic angles, just documenting the placement of objects for his own memory. He took a few shots of the wall opposite the bed. It was bare, with no painting or calendar. He made a mental note of that. Motels like this usually had at least a calendar advertising a local pizza place. His notepad lay on the desk next to his laptop. No, his laptop wasn't there. The desk's surface was empty and slightly sticky to the touch. He ran his fingers along the edge and then pulled his hand away. The stickiness remained, a residue of other people's hands, other people's mugs, other people's nights. He jotted down brief points. Few personal belongings, no identification, clothing without labels, no signs of a struggle. Each phrase sounded exactly as it should. The format dictated the language. The chair was slightly askew, one leg pressed into the carpet at an odd angle. As he bent down to straighten it, he noticed the air in the room growing heavier. Not warmer, but denser. It became difficult to breathe. He straightened up and took a deeper breath. The air smelled of chemicals, old carpet, and something stale. He kept his expression neutral, but his body betrayed his irritation. Arthur continued his inspection. The nightstand next to the bed was empty. There was no book, no phone, no glass of water. He automatically scanned for the small items that usually accompany a person, his gaze sweeping over the flat surfaces: desk, nightstand, windowsill. The sill held only a film of dust and the faint rectangular impression of something, a sign or a box that had been removed. And then Arthur noticed a strangeness. Not in an object, but in its absence. There were no clocks on the walls. His eyes settled on the space above the door where cheap motel rooms often have a round plastic clock. It was empty. He looked back at the nightstand. No wristwatch either. He noted the detail in his pad. No clocks present. The phrasing was as dry as a coroner's report. The absence of a clock didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a discrepancy. Arthur was accustomed to discrepancies. He worked with them daily, finding them in people's words, in official statements, in the brief articles he wrote. He had built a career on the space between what was said and what was true, a space that was almost always filled with the quiet hum of inconsistency. He leaned toward the chair again. It scraped against the edge of the desk, the sharp sound shattering the silence. The room answered with an echo, it shouldn't have been large enough to produce. Arthur exhaled in irritation and straightened the chair. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of its back. The chill felt out of place, an unnecessary detail in the already sterile environment. The air pressed in on him, heavier now. He felt his shoulders tense, his breath shortening. He disliked these physical reactions. They interfered with the work. He took a step toward the door, intending to open it and let in some air from the hallway. At that exact moment, the door slammed shut on its own. A draft had pulled it closed, though the window was shut. The click of the latch sounded final. The handle trembled once, then was still. Arthur stood straight, his body rigid. The room was sealed. The carpet absorbed all sound, and the walls felt too close. The lamp overhead hummed, a barely audible, grating noise. He stood in the middle of the room and listened to the sound of his own breathing. In the hallway, there was only silence. No one passed by. No one knocked. No one called out to see who was there. The seconds stretched into a long, thin wire. Arthur's hand rested on the strap of his bag, as if the contact could somehow ground him. He understood a simple fact. He could open the door at any time. There was no actual threat. And yet his body screamed for an exit, the same primal urge one feels in an elevator that has stopped between floors. He took a step toward the door. He touched the handle. The cold metal again felt wrong. He didn't turn it right away. He waited. There was no heroism in this delay, no romantic impulse. There was only a stubbornness as dry as the notes in his pad. He scanned the room again, more carefully this time. He looked at the walls, noticing the scuff marks, the traces of old fixtures, the small, empty holes where screws had once been. On one wall, there was a faint circular outline, a shade lighter than the surrounding paint. It could have been from a clock. It could have been from a cheap picture frame. He didn't draw a conclusion. He recorded the fact. He stepped closer to the wall and ran his fingers along the edge of the faint circle. A fine layer of dust coated his fingertip. He looked at the dust for a moment, then wiped it on his jeans. Wiped it away like something extraneous. It was a gesture he repeated in his work and in his life. Erase what gets in the way. He opened his notepad again and added, "Circular mark on wall." The phrasing felt clumsy, but accuracy demanded a certain weight. He took 2 more pictures of the wall. The phone's camera caught the glare of the lamp, but the outline was still visible. The cramped room felt like a dead end. The hallway had movement, air, other doors. Here, there was only one entrance, one lamp, one desk. It occurred to him that the room offered no anchor in time, not just because the clocks were gone, but because nothing here was subject to change. The curtains didn't stir, the television didn't hum, the faucet didn't drip. The silence was a solid wall. He feared that kind of silence more than any noise. In his mind, the first line of the article was already written, a template stored in the editorial system. At a roadside motel. The line demanded a follow-up, the usual set of details: date, address, a statement from the police. He could gather it all in 20 minutes, file the story, and be back at the newsroom by 9. He could do the job and ask no more questions. But standing in that room, he saw that the format couldn't contain what had happened here. It wasn't the event itself, but the absence around it. Not the death, but the void that death had occupied. The format loved a full story, a motive, a cause, a set of circumstances. Here, the word circumstances sounded like something from an instruction manual. A man with no ID, no belongings, no witnesses. A man who had only appeared in life at the moment of his disappearance. Arthur turned the handle and opened the door. The air from the hallway flowed in, carrying the scent of old carpet and someone else's perfume. Breathing became easier. He could have left. He didn't. He remained at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe. He looked down the hall at the identical doors. He looked back into the room at the empty desk. He felt a decision forming inside him, not as a grand thought or a dramatic turn, but as a quiet, practical resolve. He would gather more than the format required. He closed his notepad, put away his pen, and checked his phone. He went back to the desk and, on a fresh page, wrote, "Witnesses, clerk, diner, auto shop, adjacent rooms." The list looked like a plan, a set of directives. He didn't call it an investigation. He called it a clarification. Michael's voice echoed in his head. No fluff. He didn't argue with the voice. He understood that fluff wasn't needed. What was needed was something else, to ensure that the emptiness was truly empty, and not just a collection of poorly gathered facts. He looked again at the wall with the faint circle. He looked at the empty nightstand. He looked at the door that had slammed shut. The details didn't form a story. They formed an absence of one. It was both irritating and compelling, like a perfectly smooth road with no landmarks. Arthur stepped into the hallway and carefully pulled the door to room 12 shut. The key turned easily. The click of the lock was soft, like a period at the end of a sentence. He slipped the key into his pocket and walked back toward the reception desk. Maria looked up, her expression unchanged. "I'm done with the room for now," he said. "I have a couple of questions. Did anyone see the man in the last few days? Do you remember anything?" She furrowed her brow slightly, as if the question had added an unscheduled step to her routine. "I don't. I saw him once. He checked in yesterday evening, paid in cash, signed without a name. I recorded it as required." "Can I see the registration log?" he asked. Maria produced a thick, grid-lined notebook. The pen had left a heavy, oily mark on the paper. Arthur flipped to the correct date. In the name column, there was a dash and a short, scrawled signature that looked like a squiggle. The ID and contact columns were also blank. He ran a finger over the ink. It was already dry. "Did you ask for identification?" "I did. The man said he didn't have any. I told him he couldn't stay without it. He left a cash deposit. I checked him in. It happens." It happens. A universal lid that covered almost any infraction. Arthur nodded and returned the notebook. "Is there a diner nearby?" he asked. "On the highway, 5 minutes away. Anna's place. I get my coffee there." "An auto shop?" "Right next to it. Victor works there. I take my car to him sometimes." She said the name Victor without a last name, as if none were needed. Last names were rarely needed out here. Arthur wrote it down. Anna's place. Auto shop. Victor. The notes looked like a route. He closed the draft and put his phone away. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading for the highway. The road ahead promised the same steady rhythm, But this time he wasn't driving to close a case. He was driving to pull a minimum of context from the void. In the rearview mirror, the motel shrank until it was just a point of light. The point disappeared around a bend. He held the steering wheel steady and didn't speed up. He was in no hurry, even though the deadline stood like a metal post in the ground. No grand conclusions formed in his mind. There was only a list. The diner, the auto shop, the neighbors, the logbook, the morgue, if it came to that. The list was simple. The list was the decision. He had chosen to do more than was asked. He had chosen to step inside a story that, for now, resisted the format. He had chosen to breach the usual distance while maintaining his external composure. And at that point, he stopped the internal narrative, like placing a period at the end of a paragraph, refusing to jump ahead of the route. Anna's place was right off the highway, built like a bus shelter. Glass, plastic, a sign with faded letters, and the smell of frying oil already hanging over the gravel parking lot. Arthur pulled in and parked his Ford facing the road. The flow of traffic had thinned. Fewer trucks rumbled past and cars zipped by in short bursts. The lull before noon was a pause the diner filled with cleaning. He walked in and stopped at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the warm light. 2 air conditioners were running, but the air was still thick with grease from the kitchen. A menu was written in marker on a board on the wall. At a far table, a man in a work jacket ate soup without looking up. By the window, a woman stood with a phone and a cup of coffee. Behind the counter was Anna. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a t-shirt with the diner's logo and an apron with a stain on the pocket. She was wiping the countertop in a circular motion, as if trying to erase not just grime, but the memory of other people's elbows. The motion was repetitive, steady. Arthur approached the counter without leaning on it. He took out his press pass and showed it to her. "Arthur Vance, City Chronicle. Are you Anna?" She nodded, not breaking the rhythm of her cleaning. "I am. Is this about the motel?" "It's about the man in room 12. Did you see him?" She dropped the rag into a metal bowl and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Arthur with neither interest nor suspicion. Her gaze didn't ask why, only, how long will this take? "I saw him. He came in." "When?" Arthur opened his notepad. She tilted her chin slightly, as if consulting an internal schedule. "Always around the same time, late. After dark, but not too late. After 9. He wrote down, "After 9 p.m. The numbers felt more reliable than words. "What did he order?" "Mashed potatoes and a beef patty. Tea, no sugar. 1 bag, no lemon." She recited it like an inventory list. "He sat over there." She nodded toward a small table by the wall, where the light fell unevenly. Arthur glanced at it and noted its position, near the kitchen door, next to an outlet and a stand of paper napkins. "Did he talk?" he asked. "No," she shrugged. "I'd ask if he needed anything else. He'd just nod. He said thank you when he left." "Did he come with anyone?" "Alone." "A phone?" Arthur looked up. She thought for a moment, not feigning effort but striving for accuracy. "I didn't see a phone. He was eating. He wasn't staring at a screen. He ate his food and drank his tea." The words "ate his food and drank his tea" sounded like a final character assessment. "Do you remember what he was wearing?" "A dark jacket, dark pants." She made a gesture with her hand, like wiping dust from the air. "Nothing torn, not dirty, just ordinary." "Did you notice if he was wearing a watch?" Arthur said the word evenly, without emphasis. She frowned, as if the question had disrupted the usual script. "A watch? No. Would I have noticed? I don't look at my customers' hands." She said it without offense, it was just a rule. Arthur nodded and wrote, "Watch not observed." He understood the distinction. Not observed didn't mean not there. It meant the man had left no impression on another person's attention. "Do you remember where he went after he left?" Arthur asked. Anna raised her eyebrows slightly. "Out to the highway? I don't keep track. He paid, he left. I closed the tab." She picked up the rag again and resumed her circular wiping motion on the counter. The gesture was clear. The conversation was over. Arthur closed his notepad. "Thank you for your time." Anna nodded without a word. In the kitchen, a timer dinged. The man at the far table clattered his spoon against his bowl. Everything was proceeding in its proper order. Arthur stepped outside, inhaling the air that was colder than it had been inside. The smell of grease clung to his clothes, a stubborn residue. He got into his car, placed the notepad on his lap, and reread his notes. A neat list that offered no footholds. He was used to pulling at least one resonant word from these conversations, something that could anchor the text. Here, the words clung only to the menu. He turned the page and read the word ordinary again. A flicker of irritation rose in him, not at Anna and not at the deceased, but at the material itself, which refused to conform to the format. Michael demanded a short, factual piece. Arthur had the facts, but the facts failed to create a person. They only deepened the void. He started the engine and pulled onto the highway, staying in the right lane. The auto shop was only a few minutes away. It was a gray, corrugated metal garage with a faded sign and a dirt lot out front. The bay door was halfway open, and the sound of a compressor hissed from within. Music played on a radio, but the words were lost in the clang of metal. He parked nearby, got out, and stood for a moment at the entrance, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. A man slid out from under a car on a creeper, kicked it aside, and stood up. His hands were covered in dark, ingrained stains. He wiped them on a rag that was no cleaner than his skin. "Afternoon," he said, looking Arthur over. "Breakdown?" "Not the car," Arthur said. "I'm here about the man from the motel. Are you Victor?" The man squinted, as if weighing whether the conversation was worth his time. "I'm Victor. You mean the guy they found?" "Yes. Did you see him?" Arthur pulled out his notepad. Victor grunted, tossing the rag over his shoulder. "Saw him. He was sitting right over there." He nodded toward a bench against the wall, its vinyl cover cracked and coated in a layer of dust and boot prints. It was the kind of place you wait without asking questions. "When was this?" Arthur asked. "Yesterday, late afternoon." Victor scratched his neck with the back of his hand. "I was working on a Chevy truck for a local guy. The man came in, asked where the motel was. I told him. He asked for some water. I gave him some." "Did you talk to him?" Arthur jotted down the notes. "A little. He wasn't much of a talker. Just sat on that bench, waited for me to finish up. I asked if he needed help with anything. He said no." "Did you notice a phone? Any ID?" Victor smirked, but without malice. "Didn't see a phone. Didn't ask for ID. Who needs to show ID out here?" He walked toward the open bay door to glance at a car on a lift, its wheel removed, before returning to the conversation, as if it were a minor task he could pause and resume at will. "Do you remember anything he said?" Arthur asked. "Anything specific?" Victor looked up, as if trying to recall the sound from his memory. "I told him, 'I'm trying to finish up here. Got a line of cars waiting.' The guy just sort of smiled. And he said, 'I'm in no hurry.'" Victor delivered the line easily, with a hint of appreciation for its simple wisdom. To him, it was just a piece of everyday philosophy. Don't rush, don't sweat it. Arthur wrote the sentence down in full, his hand pausing as if the words themselves had weight. For the first time all day, he felt the urge to make it the lead, a detail that could breathe life into the sterile text. Did you notice a watch on him? He asked. Victor glanced at Arthur's own hands, as if the question were about the mechanics of timepieces. Didn't look. He was holding the cup, then put it down. His jacket covered his sleeves. I didn't see. Did he seem nervous? Nervous? Nah. Victor shook his head. He was calm, just sat there waiting, not pacing around. I've seen his type before, just passing through. The phrase passing through sounded like a category, one that erased a person's identity. Do you remember his face? Arthur asked. Victor shrugged. A face. Ordinary, not old, not young. He wiped his hands on the rag again. I could walk right past him on the street and not remember a thing. Arthur closed his notepad. Thanks for your time. I won't keep you from your work. Sure thing, Victor said. And it's strange, though. The guy was quiet. He said it more to himself than to Arthur, expecting no reply. Arthur got back in his car and opened his laptop on the passenger seat. The internet signal was spotty here, but the text file opened. He typed a few sentences, inserting Victor's words as a witness quote. The phrase fit beautifully, almost too well. It did the author's work for him, hinting at a philosophy, a conscious choice. He reread the paragraph and paused. The quote didn't connect to the cause of death, the lack of ID, or the missing clocks. It floated in the text, separate, like a sticker on a suitcase. He deleted the line. He tried again, writing a drier, more neutral version. It was worse. It was also more honest. A new wave of irritation washed over him, the desire to pull more from the phrase than it offered. Victor had said it casually, surrounded by oil and iron. Arthur was trying to turn it into a key, but the key didn't fit any lock. There was no lock yet. He closed the laptop without saving the new text, a profound sense of frustration settling in his chest. The motel seemed lower against the darkening sky, the signs still flickering as the O in Northern stubbornly refused to light. Arthur turned off the highway, the tires crunching over the rough asphalt of the entrance. His car stopped in the nearly empty lot, where another sedan was parked near the dumpsters. He cut the engine and sat in the silence, the deadline a tangible presence, a sign on a wall you couldn't ignore. He picked up his notepad and saw his own annotation next to Victor's quote. Doesn't explain. The evening air was colder now, smelling of damp earth and distant smoke. A single lamp illuminated the motel porch, casting a yellow-edged circle of light. The waterlogged cigarette butt was still there. He went inside. The lobby greeted him with the same warmth and the same smell of worn carpet. Behind the counter, Maria sat with the open registration book in front of her, though her pen was still. She looked up and gave a silent nod, as if his return were right on schedule. I'm back, Arthur said, hearing the formal, procedural tone in his own voice. Maria nodded again. I know, the room is still locked. I'll need the key, he said. She produced the keychain, the metal clinking softly against the counter. The key, with its worn plastic tag, number 12, felt warm in his palm from the lights and her hands. Housekeeping hasn't been in? Arthur asked, already knowing the answer but needing the confirmation, the ritual of the question. Housekeeping hasn't been in, Maria replied. I made sure of it. Her words were as flat as before. She asked no questions about why a journalist would return to a room where a body had been found. In a motel, questions create problems, and problems disrupt the shift schedule. Arthur walked down the hall to the left, the dim light from the overhead fixtures casting a weak, dirty glow. The lamps hummed with a low buzz, like the ventilation in the newsroom, only closer and more grating. The carpet swallowed the sound of his footsteps. Room 12 was at the end of the block. He paused at the door, listening to the silence from within. The hallway, too, was quiet. He inserted the key, turned it, and stepped inside. The room greeted him with its familiar, oppressive smallness. The smell of disinfectant had faded, but still lingered in the heavy air. He closed the door, his hand resting on the cool metal of the handle for a moment. He set his bag on the edge of the desk and surveyed the space, as if seeing it for the first time, his focus sharp and clear. For the first time since the story began, Arthur felt a concentration that bordered on professional excitement. It wasn't interest or sympathy. It was a clean, dry readiness to assemble a structure. Victor's words at the auto shop, Anna's description of the man's routine at the diner, two elements that hinted at a pattern. He thought of it like a net. Find one more point of connection, and the whole thing would pull taut. The faint, circular mark on the wall seemed to hold a new significance now, a stubborn ghost of a missing piece. He pulled out the chair and sat, the scrape of its wooden leg loud in the quiet room. He placed his palms on the desk, a preparatory gesture, like a writer about to begin typing. The room was no longer a place of death. It had become a place of resolution. He stood and crossed to the nightstand, pulling open the drawers. Empty. He had done this hours ago, but then it had been a formality. Now he was searching not for an item on a list, but for something that could explain the absence of everything else. He moved to the desk and pulled open its single drawer. It slid out smoothly, silently, as if on well-oiled runners. Inside, there was a single object. A wristwatch. It was utterly ordinary, a simple, round, unbranded face, a clear crystal with a faint scratch near the edge, and a worn leather strap cracked near the buckle holes. There was no engraving, nothing to distinguish it. It was the kind of object you never notice until it's gone. His hand hovered over the drawer, his fingers not quite touching the strap. The watch wasn't hidden. It lay parallel to the edge, placed with a quiet intention. He picked it up. The leather was still warm, as if holding the residual heat of a wrist. He lifted it to his ear. The ticking was steady, calm. The hands moved without a stutter, the second hand sweeping in precise, confident jumps. He automatically compared the time on its face with the time on his phone. They matched, almost to the minute. A wave of relief washed over him, brief and unsettling, because in this story, relief felt like a mistake. The watch was working perfectly. There was no malfunction, no failure. It had a purpose, a discipline. And yet, it was in the drawer. And in that moment, Arthur understood the difference. The object wasn't broken or lost. It had been relinquished. The thought arrived with a dangerous clarity, his mind constructing a narrative that made perfect sense. To remove the watch was to remove a point of reference. To exit the rhythm of time was to disappear without a sound. The theory was elegant. It promised a story. He held the watch in his palm, feeling its slight but definite weight. The object gave substance to what had, until now, been only a void. He took out his phone and snapped a few pictures. The open drawer, the watch inside it, a close-up of the face. The shots were functional, for reference, not effect. He closed the drawer, but kept the watch in his hand. He sat down at the desk and opened his laptop. The empty document, still titled Man_Motel, appeared instantly. He placed the watch on the desk beside the keyboard, where it lay silently, its ticking a soft, persistent metronome in the quiet room. He began to write. He wrote the lead, dry and factual. Where, when, found deceased, identity unknown. He added the essential details. No documents, no personal effects, no signs of a struggle. The format was finally taking hold. He had an object to insert into the narrative. He added a paragraph about the witnesses, mentioning Anna and Victor, their words now framed by the context of the watch. The story was pulling together, the net growing taut. His fingers moved faster, refining sentences, stripping away any word that required interpretation. For the first time, the facts felt connected. The ticking of the watch was a quiet, steady presence. The sound was calming. It was strange. In a room without time, the sound of a clock had become the background rhythm, as if the space itself had permitted its existence. He wrote, "A wristwatch was discovered in a desk drawer." He added, "The watch was in working order." He offered no conclusions. The work felt right. Not good, not comforting, just correct. It was the discipline of order. But as he wrote, an illusion of meaning began to emerge, not from metaphors, but from the structure itself. The watch, the refusal, the disappearance. He saw the pattern and let it stand, as long as it remained within the bounds of provable fact. He checked his notes. Anna, after 9. Victor, late afternoon. The timelines fit. He wrote, "The man moved along the highway," then immediately deleted it. Moved implied a purpose he couldn't prove. He settled for a more cautious phrasing. He continued editing, replacing "the man" with "the individual," the deceased with "the unidentified person." It was standard practice, a way to avoid monotony. But after a few paragraphs, he stopped. He reread the last few lines and noticed that the pronoun he had almost vanished. The text was becoming impersonal, not just by the demands of the genre, but as if the language itself were shying away from a specific human subject. The subject was disappearing from the sentences. He tried to force it back, inserting, "The man took off his watch." The phrase felt too certain, dangerously assertive. It implied an action no one had witnessed. He changed it to, "The watch had been taken off." The passive voice was safer. It removed the hand that performed the act. The text was becoming smooth, featureless, like the road that had so irritated him. Rereading the full page, he felt a sense of alienation. It read not as the story of a person, but as the description of a state of being, a state of existing in the intervals, disappearing long before the moment of death. He tried to add back the concrete details, Anna's name, the mashed potatoes, Victor's garage, but they felt like set dressing. The details held the scene together, but they couldn't hold the man. He kept typing, knowing that to stop would create a vacuum in his mind, a void that would demand a resolution beyond the format. His professional habits turned his inner anxiety into a series of paragraph edits. The watch on the desk kept ticking, wound by a hand that was no longer there. At some point, he found himself mechanically removing details instead of adding them. After 9 became in the evening. Mashed potatoes and a beef patty became the same order. The text grew more universal, almost abstract. He saw it happening and didn't stop. Then fatigue hit him like a switch being flipped. His eyes skipped a line as he was rereading a sentence. His fingers froze on the keyboard. His head felt heavy. He leaned closer to the screen, and then there was nothing. He awoke with a sharp intake of breath. The room was colder. The lamp was still on, but its light seemed dimmer. He lifted his head, the fabric of his jacket clinging unpleasantly to his arms. His mouth was dry. He blinked, trying to bring the room into focus. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the now louder ticking of the watch. He didn't know how long he had slept. In a room with no clocks, to wake up was to wake into an interval, a space between. He saw the parallel between his own state and the one he was describing. He stood and paced the small room, his steps muffled by the carpet. He peered out the window. The world outside was moving on. He returned to the desk, turned up the lamp, and looked at the laptop. The document was still open. He began to read from the beginning, not as the author, but as a stranger trying to understand. The story described a way of life, a method of dissolving into the mundane, of existing without a trace. He saw how the language shifted from a person to a category, how the markers of identity vanished, how the text assembled a condition rather than a biography. He stopped at the paragraph with the line, "A watch was discovered in the desk drawer. The item was functional. No other time-telling devices were present in the room." The words were neutral, yet they painted a picture of someone who had renounced time without breaking it. He read on and realized that in almost every paragraph, the unidentified man could be replaced with a person, and a person could be replaced with anyone. The text wouldn't lose its meaning. In fact, it would become more powerful. His eyes landed on a sentence he had typed hundreds of times. In the absence of data, any conclusions remain speculation. The phrase had always been a shield, a glass wall between him and the subject. This time, it wasn't a shield. It was a confession. He reread the draft one last time, slower now. He saw the repeating motif, the absence of urgency, of attachments, of things. He saw how every piece of testimony, from Anna, from Victor, even from Maria's silence, built not a portrait, but a void. And in that void, a different image emerged. A person who lives between events, who postpones presence, who narrows himself to a series of functions. The ticking of the watch on the desk was no longer the sound of an object, but the sound of someone else's decision, left in a drawer. And then, the final, chilling realization settled over him. The text was not about the dead man. It was about a person who exists according to deadlines, who processes facts, files stories, and leaves no trace of himself outside of his work. It was about a man who had been living in a draft for a very long time. He recognized the rhythm in his own life, not as a confession, not as an epiphany, but as a coincidence of phrasing. The same words, the same pauses, the same habit of replacing I with a person. Arthur understood then that the object of his work had shifted. The center of the story was no longer the man without a name. The center was Arthur Vance, sitting in a room without a clock, trying to build a story out of a void. This clarity brought no relief. It made the situation more dangerous than a lack of answers. Because one could hide from a lack of answers within the format, there was nowhere to hide from recognition. He closed his notepad, leaving a finger between the pages like a bookmark, and looked again at the watch on the desk. The hands moved steadily. He understood. The watch showed the time, but time no longer explained where a person was. With that, he stopped reading, stopped trying to add another line to the document. The laptop screen glowed with a cool, temperatureless light. The white field of the document seemed wider than the desk itself, the cursor blinking with the same steady discipline as a warning light in a hallway. The text was assembled. It had been reread, edited, closed, and opened again. The number of attempts had ceased to matter. The room remained unchanged. Low ceiling, yellow light, a carpet that swallowed sound. The watch on the desk ticked on, its rhythm steady, nerveless, demanding no attention, but receiving it all the same. He reread the document one last time, his eyes scanning the words he now knew by heart. The lead was in place. Where? When? Discovered. Identity unknown. What followed was what the newsroom loved. Facts, sources, cautious phrasing. The words formed a corridor through which a reader could pass without lingering, and therein lay the trap. To add an explanation would be to create a story. A story would be reassuring. It would give the reader a sense of closure. But to leave it as a protocol would be to let the man disappear completely. Any choice felt like a distortion. The first option was an appropriation of a stranger's choice. The second, a surrender to the void. Arthur sat at the desk and understood that the decision was not between truth and lies, but between different kinds of violence against the fact. He slid his notepad closer, his own pencil marks standing out. Doesn't explain. No anchor. Passive voice. The rhythm of his own hand was more recognizable in those marks than in his own thoughts. He looked up at the watch, its second hand making small, precise jumps. He looked at the document again. The final paragraph, the one he'd rewritten the most, began carefully. It contained no loud words, no direct conclusions. It was filled with the phrases he'd used for years when facts were scarce, but a story needed an ending. It is possible to assume, perhaps, a potential explanation. The paragraph had been born of habit, and that was precisely what made it so dangerous. It was an attempt to turn a void into something meaningful, something another person could consume and forget. He read the final sentence aloud, his voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, and he knew that if he left it, the reader would receive a version of the truth that was convenient, a story that would allow them to put the man on a shelf and walk away. But if he removed it, the article would become what his editor had requested, a brief, forgettable notice. The system would get what it wanted, and the man would vanish without a trace. It was two exits leading to the same emptiness. The only difference was who made the final gesture. He could no longer proceed on autopilot. To do so would be to accept a choice made for him by the rules of the format. He looked at the watch one last time. It was an object that held a gesture. It had been taken off. It had been left. It was still running. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a refusal of time itself. And his text was attempting to substitute that refusal with a meaning that could be printed and filed away. The final sentence was an act of completion. And completion, he now understood, was a form of theft. The theft of the right to remain undescribed. Arthur hit the delete key. The motion was short, clean. The final sentence vanished. The cursor jumped to the end of the previous line, leaving a larger field of white space. Nothing happened. The lamp didn't flicker. The watch didn't stop. The room accepted the action with the same indifference it had shown his presence. He felt no relief, but a rare sense of stability. Not confidence, but an absence of fluctuation. He hadn't made the right choice. He had made the only one that required no justification from him. He reread the text. It was almost invisible now, the kind of peace the system absorbs without resistance. But this invisibility was different. It was chosen. He saw every clean corner and understood why it had been left empty. He reached for the watch and turned it face down on the desk. He didn't put it back in the drawer. He simply removed the dial from his sight. The gesture was enough. He saved the file, attached it to a new email with the subject line, Motel, short, and hovered his cursor over the send button. He pressed it. The email disappeared. The process was finished, but the story was not. Professional detachment had always been his shield, a way to maintain distance, but now he saw that the distance had never protected him from other people's stories. It had protected him from his own emptiness between deadlines. He stood and walked to the window. The highway was alive with lights, people moving toward destinations beyond this motel. The realization settled in, not as an aphorism, but as a simple, uncomfortable truth. The line between the one who describes and the one being described is always conditional. It wears thin not in moments of revelation, but in the routine. Arthur didn't close the laptop right away. He sat with his hands on the table, staring at the darkened document that was no longer before his eyes. The usual reaction didn't kick in, to check if he was late, if a revision would come through, if he needed to prepare for a call. These thoughts hadn't disappeared forever, but at this moment, they didn't activate. He noted this with a dry interest, the way one notes a rare deviation from the norm. Professional detachment had always worked as a defense. It allowed him to keep his distance, not to get involved, not to let other people's deaths pass through him. For a long time, Arthur had considered this distance a virtue. He saw it as a guarantee of objectivity. Now it became clear. The distance wasn't protecting him from other people's stories. It was protecting him from his own emptiness between deadlines. From that rhythm of life where existence is measured by submissions and the rest is filled with waiting for the next task. This understanding didn't form into a confession. It didn't demand admissions. It simply stood beside him, like a fact that could no longer be ignored. Arthur stood up and walked around the room. His steps were muffled by the carpet. He touched the edge of the bed without sitting down. He went to the window, pushed the curtain aside a few more inches. Outside, the highway continued its own life. The light from headlights passed in short streaks. People were going somewhere further than this motel. He didn't draw any conclusions about himself. Conclusions are a form of text. For now, the text was sent. Arthur understood one more thing. He could no longer consider himself just an observer. Observation turned out to be a form of participation, even if he had called it neutral for years. The filter through which he processed reality shaped it no less than the actions of other people. He didn't know if his work would change after this case. He didn't know if he would start writing differently. These questions required time, and time in this room was behaving strangely. He knew only one thing. The automatism had cracked. And this crack could no longer be plastered over with a format. Arthur looked again at the watch lying face down. He didn't turn it back over. He didn't put it away in a drawer. He left the object where it had ended up by his will, not by habit. The final understanding didn't come as an aphorism. It didn't form a neat formula. It was simple and unpleasant because it offered no comfort. The line between the one who describes and the one being described is always conditional. It's thinner than is commonly believed. It doesn't get erased in a moment of confession, but in the routine. The story ended here, not with an answer, not with a conclusion, but with this knowledge that didn't fit into any single paragraph and required no printing.